40 years ago, the richest country in the world was a place you may never have heard of, the island nation of Nauru. With 11,000 residents living on 8 square miles of land, the Republic of Nauru is the third smallest country in the world, behind only the Vatican and Monaco. A generation or two ago, this island nation had the highest per capita GDP of any place in the world. Regular citizens were enjoying the good life, zooming around in luxury sports cars. Then the island was hit by the single largest economic collapse ever experienced by any one country, the result of what economists call the resource curse, or Dutch disease, brought on by the collapse in production of phosphate ore, the country's major and only export. Yet today Nauru is bouncing back with its GDP more than doubling in just the past 10 years. Unfortunately, that's thanks to a grim reality. Nauru today makes its money by having turned itself into a detention center for refugees. So how did this tiny island nation go from being the world's richest jurisdiction to having the world's worst economic collapse? And what can we learn from its economic crisis? In this video, we'll answer these questions, but before we begin, be sure to subscribe to our channel to get notifications on our latest videos. And if you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. Europeans first discovered Nauru in 1798 when British sea captain John Fearn spotted the land from his ship. It was a lush green island covered in trees and ringed by white sand beaches. The Brits were so impressed by Nauru's natural beauty that they named it Pleasant Island. Of course, by that point, the island had been settled by Micronesians for some 3,000 years. The local population, who called themselves Nauruan, lived in a land of plenty. They had as healthy a diet as any people on the planet, eating coconuts and breadfruit, and fishing in the ocean. The Nauruans found themselves living in a British colony, at least until 1888, when Britain handed the island over to Germany, which at that time was busy building its own overseas colonial empire. It was during this period of German rule that a fateful discovery was made on Nauru. The island was rich in deposits of high-grade phosphate ore, a blend of algae and bird droppings that had petrified into rock form. As repulsive as bird droppings and algae may sound, in terms of wealth, the phosphate was as good as gold. Phosphate is used as a fertilizer and animal feed, and in 1906, phosphate mining began on Nauru. In those years, much of the wealth from the phosphate went to the colonial power, Germany. Then World War I broke out and Australia seized Nauru from the Germans. After the war, it was Australia that benefited from the phosphate mining. During World War II, Japan invaded Nauru and ruled the island through terror. They executed the sick in mass drownings, deported political dissidents, and pressed the local population into forced labor to build them an airbase. Japan's rule over Nauru was so brutal that by the end of war, only about 600 of the island's 3,000 inhabitants remained. In the years after World War II, Nauru began to bounce back from the devastation, and its population began to grow. At that time, it was run jointly by a group of trustees consisting of Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. But the age of colonialism was coming to an end, and by 1968, Nauru gained its independence. The newly sovereign people of Nauru clamored for the country's phosphate wealth, and the government delivered. It's estimated that at the time of independence, Nauru's resource wealth was equal to $500,000 per resident, so there was plenty of money to go around. Royalties paid to landowners made many Nauruans rich. The government's coffers filled with phosphate money, and political leaders set up free education and a free healthcare system. By the 1970s, Nauru was rolling in dough, and by 1980 it had a per capita GDP of $27,000. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $88,000 in today's money. To give you a sense of how much that is, at that time, the per capita GDP of the US was around $14,000. The average Nauruan was twice as wealthy as the average American. In one famous story about Nauru at that time, the island's police chief imported a Lamborghini, only to discover once it arrived that he couldn't fit into it. Nauru was experiencing an obesity epidemic. Its traditional diet of coconuts and fish had disappeared. The phosphate mines had destroyed much of the island. 1/3 of its surface area had been completely strip-mined by 1968. The place that the British called Pleasant Island no longer existed. What existed instead was a rocky, empty moonscape and a population that had to import its food. In this devastated environment, there was little fruit to be found. With their newly extracted phosphate wealth, Nauruans imported processed foods from Australia and elsewhere. Pretty soon, the country was dealing with a weight problem. And by that point, the endgame for Nauru's phosphate wealth was already in sight. The country's people and government were aware of the fact that the phosphate was running out. They just didn't know what to do about it. By the 1990s, phosphate production on Nauru had dropped to less than a quarter of the level of the 1970s. Nauru's economy began to suffer. Unemployment began to rise, eventually hitting 90%. The phosphate-funded school system collapsed. Eventually, the country's GDP fell to just 10% of what it had been at its peak. Nauru was suffering from what economists call the resource curse, or Dutch disease. Imagine you're a country or a region where great natural resource wealth is discovered. Maybe it's oil or gold or even phosphate from bird droppings. This resource proves to be far more profitable than anything else you're doing in the economy. In terms of profits made, it simply makes sense to invest everything in this resource, and doing anything else stops making sense. So even as your country gets rich from this natural resource, everything else the country was doing, farming, manufacturing, services, whatever it was, begins to go away. But nobody much seems to care because everyone is making so much money from this natural resource. Eventually, though, the natural resource begins to run out. Revenue starts shrinking. That's when you notice that your economy has nothing else going for it. Your other industries have gone away and other countries have taken your market share. All your investment capital went into the cash flow natural resource, so you don't have money to start up new industries. You no longer have the skilled workforce needed to launch new businesses, and chances are your government committed to social spending programs that it can no longer afford. And now you're stuck with a shrinking economy and no prospects. This is the resource curse, or Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands, which experienced it with oil back in the 1970s. And so Nauru suffered from history's worst case of Dutch disease. The country's overseas real estate assets were seized. The national airline's airplanes, yes, this tiny island had a national airline, were repossessed. And eventually even the country's central bank went bankrupt. To be fair, it's not like the government was caught completely unaware. In fact, back in 1970, it had set up what's known as a sovereign wealth fund, essentially a savings account where phosphate royalties could accumulate, giving Nauru a fund with which to start new businesses once the phosphate runs out. A sovereign wealth fund is a great idea. Just take a look at Norway, which has been collecting oil royalties in its own wealth fund for decades. Today, Norway's fund has $1.3 trillion. That's trillion with a T. That's more than $240,000 for every man, woman, and child in Norway. But that's not how things worked out for Nauru. Its own wealth fund, which at one point accumulated as much as $1 billion Australian dollars, was badly mismanaged. The fund had a ridiculous number of administrators with more than 1,500 people employed in a country that only had about 10,000 people at the time. The money in the fund was wasted on things like golfing trips to the Bahamas and on some very poor investments. One of those investments was a London play called Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love. This musical told a fictional story about a love triangle between Leonardo da Vinci, Mona Lisa, and a soldier. Nauru's wealth fund invested £2 million British pounds into the show's production, and it turned into a disaster. The play was beset by script problems, set problems, and costume problems. It premiered at London's Strand Theatre in June of 1993, and by the time the debut show was over, most of the audience had left. The show closed after an unimpressive 5-week run, and Nauru lost its investment. Which is not to say that all of Nauru's investments were a farce like Leonardo the Musical. As the country sank into poverty in the 1990s, the government came up with a very effective, if not entirely moral, plan for its economy. They decided in essence to copy the success of some Caribbean islands in becoming a global offshore banking haven. Beginning in the early 1990s, Nauru issued banking licenses to around 400 banks from overseas. The country also launched a pay-for-citizenship scheme, which allowed wealthy individuals from elsewhere in the world to obtain a Nauruan passport in exchange for cash. At first, this plan was a huge success, financially speaking, but stop to think about what offshore banking and purchased passports are used for. Nauru had turned itself into a major haven for money laundering and tax evasion. So much so that in 2001, as part of the Patriot Act passed after the 9/11 attacks, the U.S. declared Nauru an epicenter of money laundering and forbade U.S. banks from doing business in the country. In its desperation to compensate for the loss of phosphate wealth, Nauru had become a rogue state. But in 2005, under intense international pressure, the country began shutting down its offshore banking sector. Once again, Nauru's economy was at risk of another total collapse. But by then, something else had happened in Nauru. In August of 2001, a Norwegian freighter named the MV Tampa rescued 433 refugees, mostly Afghanis, from a sinking ship in international waters. The ship headed for the Australian coast, but the Aussie government wouldn't give it permission to dock in the country. Instead, it arranged for the refugees to be sent to Nauru. There, the Australians built what would become known as the Nauru Regional Processing Center, which consisted of 2 detention facilities for refugees. This facility has been open on and off for more than 20 years now, and in that time, it has become the cornerstone of Nauru's economy, even despite vocal opposition from many locals who don't want to see their country become an open-air prison for refugees. But the detention center was too lucrative for Nauru to pass up. As of 2019, the contract for running it was worth $29 million per month. That amounts to around $31,000 per year for every person in Nauru. In 2020, the government of Nauru estimated that in the previous fiscal year, 58% of its revenue came from the regional processing center, and 15% of all the jobs in Nauru were at the center. Meanwhile, Nauru has also been making money by selling fishing licenses. Under the Nauru Agreement of 2010, 8 South Pacific Island nations agreed on a common licensing scheme for foreign commercial fishing boats. These countries, including Nauru, controlled 1/4 of the world's supply of tuna fish, and in 2020, Nauru's revenue from fishing licenses amounted to $73 million. With all that's going on, Nauru has seen its economy rebound. The country's per capita income has grown 5-fold since 2007, and in 2020, the World Bank classified it once again as a high-income country. Crucially, the things that have rescued Nauru's economy, the detention center and the fishing licenses, were not the result of Nauru's doing. Rather, random chance and luck have shaped the island's economy over the past few decades. If Australia were more open to refugees, or if Nauru's neighbors were less interested in licensing commercial fishing boats, Nauru could still be stuck in the clutches of Dutch disease. The island nation is a warning to the world: never put all your eggs in one basket. If you like this video, hit the like button, which helps us spread the word about our channel, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you get notifications about our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.